Well, good afternoon or good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for hosting me today and allowing me to tell you a bit about some of my research, and especially my research dealing with what we call Salafism and Jihadism. It's a true pleasure to be here, ladies and gentlemen, to be in front of such a distinguished audience, to tell you about these topics, these very burning topics that I presume you are very interested in. Because, of course, if you have a look at the news, at the papers, in Belgium, in France, in North America, in the Middle East, of course, in Asia, in Africa, in many regions in the world, we have to consider some issues related to these notions of Salafism, Jihadism, so-called radical Islam, and so on. First of all, allow me to express my gratitude to the Chair Gulen for Intercultural Studies and for offering me to discuss these issues today with you. It's always very pleasant, to talk to young audience like yours today. I hope I'm not going to bother you too much, and I'm going to make it as interesting, as living as possible. And in advance, please, all apologies if you are bored because of me. So this is the plan. Basically, I'm going to talk. Well, I hope it's not bothering, because I have planned to talk to you on these issues for, let's say, 1 hour, to give you a historical, religious, sociological, political overview when it comes to these issues, Salafism, Jihadism, and so on. And then, in the second part, I'm going to move to, let's say, more living discussion with slides on the issue of radicalization, and more specifically on the issue of European radicalization. Are you okay with that? Thank you very much. So, among all these issues, and I need to apologize again because I had almost 1 day trip from Singapore to here, so I'm a bit jet lagged, but well, I'm trying to do as best as possible. So, what we have become used to call Salafism and Jihadism surely represent the most terrible words that someone who would be interested in the Islamic world situation today, actually Islamic world and beyond, by the way, would have to worry about. The historical hegemony of bodies or entities such as Al-Qaeda, the rise of the Islamic State organization, the participation of Salafi political parties into national landscapes, the visibility of some religious customs such as the full veil, for example, for some women, are striking illustrations of what some people tend to describe today as, in quotes, radical Islam. As very often, what we have to deal with is notions and representations. As I am going to demonstrate, Salafism and Jihadism have to do primarily with concepts. These two words having gone historically through different and even opposite understandings, and framings. Personally, one of my very first contacts with this Salafism word or concept was when I was discussing with some Muslims years ago, and I heard a young preacher from Algeria using the Arabic expression. Are there some Arabic-speaking people here? Yeah. Don't be ashamed, it's okay. So it was the first time I heard about Salafism as a notion, as an expression. It was when I had to do with a young preacher from Algeria using the Arabic expression. He basically translated into, this is not a thing that used to be done by the Salaf, or this is not the custom of the Salaf. The Arabic word Salaf actually refers to the linguistic root SLF, Salafa, which echoes to whatever is related to anteriority or precedence. Contrary to the root Khalaf, Khalafa, responding to the notions of posteriority and succession. For instance, have you ever heard of the word Caliph? You know the Caliph Baghdadi, who proclaimed himself to be a Caliph in 2014. The word Caliph comes from the Arabic Khalif, and refers to being what we can call a successor of the messenger of God, the prophet. Because this word, this root, khalafa, refers to the posterity or succession. On the other way around, on the contrary, the racine, or the root, not the racine, jet lagged. Salaf, does refer, to the notion or to the essence of what comes before and not what comes after. By using this word, Salaf, towards his own daughter, by saying these words, "What an excellent Salaf you have," talking about himself, the Prophet Muhammad, as an example, used to emphasize how essential it was to learn from the predecessors, especially at a time when the Islamic religion was revealed under its purest form ever. In addition, the word Salaf is also completed by another, Salah, alluding to anything that is valuable. See, for instance, the figure of the leader that you have probably heard of, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, Saladin, you know this name, the winner of the Hattin battle in 1187. By referring now to this expression made of these two words, Salaf, Salih, the Islamic tradition does describe and pay attention to the first generations of Muslims. The expression Salaf, Salih, can be thus translated as wise ancients, pious predecessors, or the virtuous preceding ones. Which principally indicate the contemporary companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and then the two following generations coming after them. So we have here a clear fundamentalist, in the primary meaning of the word, approach, because what we have to do here is, what we have to focus on is the necessity, when you are a Salafi, so you have to follow the example of the Salaf Salih. To understand the historical circumstances through which the appeal to the Salafiyya, so the necessity to return to the Salaf Salih generations, that we know may define as a desire to restore and recover the true meaning of the Islamic faith, we need in reality to know how some specific and sometimes radical conceptions have emerged across centuries. So highlighting the necessity to refer to the Salaf Salih and to that extent become a Salafi, someone who is following the example of the Salaf Salih. We are led to consider the impact and the significance of non or extreme religious factors that have played a role, so one precise way of understanding the religious corpus has been accepted to the detriment of another. So to do so, I will first of all focus on three historical figures whose preaching and reaction against some changes at their time have unquestionably contributed to shape Salafism until the current period. I will start with a very provocative question. When and how the West has become Christian? This sentence is actually the title of one French historian book, Paul Venn, who through this experience gave us a relevant framework to understand the history of connections between religion and power at the head of some states, or states that were to be Christians. This work, based on an in-depth study, is structured around one main idea. The political power, under the pressure of several factors, makes the decision to convert to one religion in order to establish or to renew with legitimacy. By reversing our perception and perspective, we are led to consider how religious traditions, discourses and identities are more or less secondary, I said more or less, of course, secondary compared mainly with political motivations. Contrary to several narratives primarily affected by the impact of ideas and transcendental ideology on human conduct, visions, and self-justifications, this pattern aims at underlining the value of more material factors such as political assessment, power struggles, particular interest, and actors' rivalry. In other words, are not religious reforms and quest for truth to be accounted for by mundane reasons echoing to specific political agendas. To sum up, does the religion identity explain or has to be explained if you choose to focus on some historical periods within which political power and religious attempts have reciprocally used each other so as to win or maintain authority? Such an assumption and framework has a very concrete implication on the micro-sociological level. Indeed, if we decide to focus on actors' trajectories, especially across crises that are most of the time integral parts of dynamics through which some political players contest some regimes in the name of a right understanding of religion, we are forced to acknowledge that conversions to some religions or religiosities are clearly connected to power reconstructions. To that end, some historians insist on the necessity of religious ideas, groups and preachers, so the political struggle evolves towards some specific directions and allows newcomers to appear as defenders of authenticity and crucial social identity. To put it differently, before moving to more empirical consideration, that I'm going to do, of course, taken from the study of Islamic states and societies across centuries, my key questions deal with conditions under which political newcomers or competitors make their ambition and strategy interact with new religious frameworks to enhance both personal legitimacy and social support. In this respect, my aim, of course, is not to evacuate the theological dimension that has impacted on Muslim societies, evolutions, and more precisely, people beliefs, but to emphasize on the use of religion as part of races to power. To that extent, I am going to tackle the issue of claimed Islamic authenticity and the way through which political players have gone in order to build their legitimacy by the means of what we can see a religious policy. Indeed, in the name of the search for social and moral foundation, they have attempted to reframe religious norms to gain in terms of capabilities of undermining competitors' ambitions. So religion is used in a double perspective, allowing some actors to employ it as an asset for ideological subversion. By the same time, they introduce themselves as the very defenders of verity, and being simultaneously the avant-garde of Islam and demanding political obedience when power is seized. These presentations will be dedicated to three major examples of intertwined religious policies during three specific periods in Islam history, under which circumstances have connections between theological reforms and races to power being so close that struggling against some regimes was seen as challenging Islam itself. Every time that Islam has been seen as endangered by some theological speculation or in respect from political leaders, some clerics, scholars, have taken the lead of a reaffirmation of verity, challenging themselves the contemporary power and siding next to the people gathering around their search for authenticity. Sociologically, these periods have in common the emergence of a social group, which is the ulama in Arabic, the religious clerics, the religious scholars, in charge of producing Islamic norms, sharing one dual position. On the one hand, they have the ability to legitimize one power, underlining the fact it matches religious expectations. On the other hand, they have the possibility of defying other political regimes by warning believers or fellow believers against their supposed deviance, the deviance of the rulers, of the political powers. Dialectics between orthodoxy and heterodoxy is therefore at the heart of this massive reworking of Islamic thought and doing so of political landscape. So that's the end of my introduction, and I will be happy now to tell you more about these three main figures through which I'm going to tell you more about Salafism and Jihadism right now. I don't know if you have some notions of Islamic history, but I will be happy to tell you more if you have some questions afterwards. The first figure that I'm going to tell you a bit about is Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And my question with Ahmad ibn Hanbal is to wonder to what extent, with him we can talk about the birth of Salafism. The fall of the Umayyad Caliphate in the middle of the 8th century allows a new dynasty to seize power and to claim for the return of Islamic true values to run the society. As the first example, traditional Muslim observers underline the fact that the first Abbasids, so the dynasty coming after the Umayyad, evoke to describe their rise to power the word dawla, whose one of the meanings is revolution, insisting in this way on the fact that they bring back religion in the front stage. Another illustration of this search for legitimacy, due mainly to the necessity of convincing the people that Umayyads were on the wrong path, refers to names chosen at that time by Abbasids and alluding clearly to their supposed moral skills. For instance, at that time, certain caliphs such as Abu al-Abbas demanded to be called as Al-Mahdi, the well-guided, while his brother Abu al-Ja'far was named Al-Mansur, the winner. More fundamentally, on account of tensions, rebellions, and conflicts opposing some tribal, ethnic, or denominational groups, because of jet lag, to the central authority based from that time in Baghdad, Iraq today, orthodoxy becomes a major issue for actors desiring to establish political predominance. The fourth fitna, fitna is a crisis in Arabic, putting up al-Ma'mun to mobilize religion to face its opponents, is probably the key factor explaining why he is the caliph the most involved in theological debates. Even more, he is the one of the very first to tie his power to the defense of what is built as an orthodoxy from now on, impossible to struggle without defying his or challenging his authority. Such evolutions and risks for his legitimacy led him to consider seriously the high importance of more private authorities, mainly the scholars, the famous ulama. This quite new framework represents a real turmoil in Islamic history, since this caliph, Al-Ma'mun, at the 8th century, realizes how interesting it may be to combine more closely religion and power. The main consequence is nothing but some greater influence given to these scholars as agents of reinforcement. Because of movements referring to different readings of the holy sources or the holy scriptures and using it to contest the central authority, creating in some cases real civil wars, highlight preachers who some of them were nostalgic of the Umayyad period in their role of undermining what they perceive as violations to Islamic principles. Across the 7th century, religion has started being understood on the basis of a more Sunnah-centered approach. You know the word Sunnah, it refers, to what the Prophet Muhammad, has left behind him as a model, as a pattern, in terms of behaviors, in terms of sayings, in terms of way of life, the Prophet's way of life. This notably implies that the scholars, the ulama, are more and more from that time onwards, more and more specialized into knowledge of Muhammad's claims, al-ahadith, Muhammad's sayings, Muhammad's words. Doing so, they tend to become not only preachers, but experts of religion. It does not mean that during Al-Ma'mun's rule, we witnessed a massive turmoil. Clerics have always been, in fact, central within Islamic societies, but they used to be considered, first of all, as private players, whose work was not so related to political authorities. However, declining legitimacy and religious ferment pushed powers to engage much more into theological debates and issues. With a very important event at that time called Al-Mihna, what we can translate into English as the ordeal or the Inquisition, starting with the emergence of the Mu'tazila school. Al-Ma'mun uses, in the framework of a subversive strategy, religion, so he used religion, as the key asset to appear as the very defender of orthodoxy. This notion is for now highly connected to political agendas. As a result, from that time, boundaries between religion and power begin being the subject of an interpretation, in which political players are part of a dangerous dialectics for them. Clerics, scholars, are as much factors of legitimation and tools for struggling competitors as possible competitors themselves able to undermine insiders' rule. By filling both positions, insider and outsider, in relation to established powers, they have the potential to create either stability or revolution. It is so because of a larger will from the Caliph to reorganize the state around more resistant foundations. Search for orthodoxy consequently stems from this willpower to make its power more solid. by striving after an imam caliph position, in being a caliph and an imam, deserving to be obeyed and followed on the ground of his religious predominance, Al-Ma'mun is about to experience the dual profile of clerics, scholars, who from private players are going to become key figures within public debates. Their emergence is widely illustrated by this very famous scholar named Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who decided to struggle the decision made by Al-Ma'mun, the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, to make the thesis of a created on earth Quran obligatory, embracing this way several theological current teaching like Al-Mu'tazila school, which is a very rationalistic school. The Caliph went so far that he ordered to punish all the clerics, all the scholars, all the judges refusing to acknowledge this rationalistic principle. Thus, Ahmad ibn Hanbal took the lead of a counter-reform, promoting the irrelevancy of such a religious approach. To him, the political power had started failing in decreeing that was, to his view, a major deviance, Arabic, bid'ah, bid'ah in Arabic meaning deviance, an attempt to falsify Islam. That is how the figure of the cleric became political, but in an antagonistic perspective. In fact, with this responsive preaching, we have one of the very first tries to examine what orthodoxy should be. Referring to the centrality of pious ancestors, the famous Salih, Ahmad ibn Hanbal underlined the value of returning to the holy writings as opposed to what he considered as theological speculation influenced by non-Islamic conceptions. The prestige acquired by Ibn Hanbal, starting so to be taken as the true defender of authenticity by many Muslims, shows the extreme difficulty to use orthodoxy as an exclusive tool to run one society, given that political actors, by doing so, open up the field of contestation and reinforce their opponents' arguments, provided some clerics build up a stronger religious construction. As a result, by claiming being a man of the text, by the same time he advocated for learning from the pious ancestors who were introduced for one of the very first times in Islamic history as the people of tradition, as the opposite of Al-Ma'mun's darlings seen as the people of the reason, Ibn Hanbal became de facto a defying imam. All in all, the appearance of a Salafi doctrine or discourse from that time enlightens the strategic appeal of the very first generations of Muslim. By demanding their legacy, Ibn Hanbal won fame in restoring what many believers perceived as falsified Islam, and highlighting the role of writing, especially Muhammad's words, the Hadith. Ibn Hanbal made people of the Hadith, the Ahl al-Hadith, a social group organized in order to defend their religious views against one caliph's attempt to tie forever Islam and power. In doing so, we are led to consider the dual dimension of religion, supporting power on the one hand and unrecognizing its legitimacy on the other hand in case of failure. One of Al-Ma'mun's successors, Al-Mutawakkil, decided to go back to the credo that the Quran was revealed from above and not created on earth, illustrating by this way the reluctance of many social groups to follow Al-Ma'mun, so the rationalistic caliph, desire to set some orthodoxies whose warden would be him. Am I clear? It's okay? Okay. My second figure, my second example, his name is Ibn Taymiyyah. Ahmed Abu al-Abbas Taqi ibn Taymiyyah. He was born in 1263 and he passed away in 1328. He is an Islamic scholar who lived at a time when the historical caliphate was no longer a reality. So over Ibn Hanbal's life, the caliphate was a reality centuries before him. But at that time when Ibn Taymiyyah lived, it was no longer a reality, allowing military and political leaders to claim fighting again for verity in order to create their own kingdom or sultanate. Moreover, what we know today as the Middle East was no longer under Arab regimes' rule, and more specifically, territories known today as Syria, Kurdistan, Palestine, to some extent Turkey, and other territories passed to the Mongols' domination. Having been educated inside the Hanbali school, the one before that I just told you about, he is considered to be one of the greatest Islamic scholars of all times. I'm talking about Ibn Taymiyyah, and especially because some states in the 20th century, such as Saudi Arabia, first of all have reintroduced his thought as one of the most influential in the global Islamic landscape. Not only a religious scholar, but also a kind of political activist, he differs from Ibn Hanbal. He took part in several battles against communities and powers that he did not see as Muslims. Al-Alawiyya, which is according to him a sect, for example, in Syria, that used to live in Syria, representing a specific version of Shiism, was in the Khorasan, so in the Middle East, in a territory astride Lebanon and Syria. Ibn Taymiyyah called Shia at that time the Rawafid, for instance, and this word actually, the Rawafid, referring to Shias, can be translated into renegades in English. He has lived most of his life in Damascus, where some of his biggest judgments have been made. He was also imprisoned 6 times over his lifetime, partly because of conflicts with the leaders at that time and his religious views about what was serious deviations to him. He was, in fact, known for being unfriendly with and discrediting vigorously any position that was, to his view, a distortion or denaturation of Islam. Ibn Taymiyyah's attitude towards his own rulers was based on the actions of the companions of the Prophet, of course, when they made an oath of allegiance to the Islamic Prophet Muhammad as follows: to obey within obedience to God, even if the one giving the order is unjust, to abstain from disputing the authority of those who exert it, and to speak out the truth or take up its cause without fear in respect of God, of blame from anyone. However, some specific events are going to make him take positions that up to 2017, some scholars are still discussing. I have said that some Islamic kingdoms at that time were ruled by the Mongols, who converted of Islam during the 13th century. Ibn Taymiyyah, as a scholar, imam, jurisconsult, judge, preacher, and activist, has remained very famous for his understanding of the Mongols' leaders' behavior at that time. Because some of them had invaded Syria, which was ruled by the Mamluk dynasty at that time, he joined the struggle against them and was not only part of the political protest against the Mongols, but also, and I would say principally, the religious disqualification against them. The first invasion took place between December 1299 and April 1300 due to the military campaign by the Mamluks against the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, who were allied with the Mongols. The Ilkhanate army managed to reach Damascus by the end of December 1299. Ibn Taymiyyah went with a delegation of Islamic scholars to talk to one of their leaders, Ghazan Khan, who was the Khan of the Mongols of Iran, to plead clemency. Then several other invasions, during which he was again and again one of the figures protecting the people and asking for the end of the war. For example, the year 1303 saw the third Mongol invasion of Syria, once again by Ghazan Khan, and what has been called Ibn Taymiyyah's most famous fatwa, the word fatwa refers to a judgment, religious judgment, was issued against the Mongols in this war, and Ibn Taymiyyah declared that jihad against the Mongol attack on the Mamluk Sultanate was not only permissible but obligatory. The reason being that the Mongol could not, in his opinion, be true Muslims despite the fact that they had converted to Sunni Islam, because they ruled using what he considered man-made laws, their traditional Yasa code, a Mongol code, rather than Islamic law, the famous Sharia. Because of this, he reasoned they were living in a state of jahiliyyah, which means non-Islamic pagan ignorance, and this fatwa broke new Islamic legal ground because no jurist had ever before issued a general authorization for the use of lethal force against Muslims in battle, and was to influence modern Islamists and jihadists in the use of violence against self-proclaimed Muslims. So with Ibn Taymiyyah we have a clear breakup. For one of the very first times in history, we have someone saying that you can be a Muslim ruler, but a fake Muslim ruler, because your judgments are not on your legislation or your when you exert power. It's not based on Islamic Sharia, but on, for example, in this case, Mongol legislation. My third and last example, his name is Mohamed-Ali Adraoui, who struggled for, once again, the return to the Salaf Salih beliefs in the Arabian Peninsula, but this time in the 18th century. So Ahmad ibn Abdul Wahhab, you have probably heard of the word Wahhabism, who is a version of Salafism in the Arabian Peninsula since the 18th century. He lived in the Arabian Peninsula over the 18th century, and he's also famous for rejecting all what seemed to be, according to him, in contradiction with the Salaf Salih legacy. If his preaching and teaching refers today to the notion of Wahhabism, this concept was never used to describe his activity while he was alive. Like Ibn Hanbal and Ibn Taymiyyah, he opposed certain customs, ideas, and discourses that were incompatible with the true face to his eye. For instance, he is well known for condemning worshipping saints in the Arabian Peninsula at that time and beyond, because we know that he traveled a lot, for instance, to Iraq, and he did a lot to restore the authentic understanding of God unicity, tawheed in Arabic, opposed to practicing idolatry and polytheism, the shirk in Arabic. What makes him very specific and famous is first of all the pact that he formed with the head of the House of Al Saud in 1744, through which he offered a strong religious and Islamic legitimacy to a very state builder interested in challenging the Ottoman Empire's influence and building a new dynasty that is still surviving at some point today. This Najdi alliance, Najd is the region where Al Saud on the one hand and Wahhab on the other hand made this pact, embodied, by this pact of 1744, also called the Dir'iyah Pact. Dir'iyah is the city where the pact was made, has given birth to the first Saudi kingdom a couple of years afterwards. That will be destroyed by their contenders, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, ruled by Mohamed-Ali. Egypt was at the time, a part of the Ottoman Empire. And before supporting Muhammad bin Saud, Abdul Wahhab has supported for several years another leader. We know less about that, but it's also very interesting to know, Uthman bin Muammar, with whom he decided to start his puritanical reform, consisting, in his view, in leveling graves, destroying trees under which some people used to pray, and so on. Under which some people, used to pray, and so on. And these actions gained the attention of another, tribal leader, Sulayman bin Muhammad bin Ghurayr of the tribe Bani Khalid, the chief of Al-Qatif region, who had substantial influence in the Najd region. And this tribal, before Al-Saud, this tribal chief well, I will not tell you about this, it will be too specific. I'm going to focus on the pact between Al-Wahhab and Al-Saud. We have a very famous sentence at that time, actually. That's what actually they made a pact. There is a famous sentence, actually, when Al-Saud started, discussing with Abdul Wahhab at that time, and that's what he said to him. This oasis is yours, talking about this city, Dir'iyah. Do not fear your enemies. By the name of God, if all Najd was summoned to throw you out, we will never agree to expel you. And that's why, that's how Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab replied to Al-Saud. You are the settlement's chief and wise man. I want you to grant me an oath that you will perform jihad, so struggle to spread Islam in his view, against the unbelievers. And in return, you will be Imam, leader of the Muslim community, and I will be the leader in religious matters. So in 1744, actually, we have witnessed a major change in the history of preaching, not because that it was the first time it happened, but it rested upon political power, but because in the 20th century, this religious school actually would impact most of the world, and jihad understood that the right to declare violent action against someone who is supposed to be sinful as legitimate would get global. This power sharing pact between Abdul Wahab on the one hand and Al Saud on the other hand, is still at the heart of the Saudi political, religious, and social system. Now I'm going to end up this presentation with a look at what we are going through since the 20th century. Two main ideologies over the 20th century have intensively contributed to the restoration of a fundamentalist comprehension of religion that could justify and legitimate the use of political violence against some specified groups of people. The first one is the pan-Islamist movement called Association of the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamiat al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, that was born in Egypt in 1927 in Ismailiyah, the city of Ismailiyah, and was founded by a school teacher named Hassan al-Banna, whose ambition was to give birth again to a Salafi understanding of the religion, but with a non-religious major change compared to the previous centuries, which was the use of the modern political tools, probably influenced by how people and societies used to do politics at that time in Europe, with namely the communist experience. This combination is at the heart of what we call today Islamism, a mixture between a fundamentalist approach to Islam, as well as the creation of the very first political movement, thriving for generating a new social order based on the religious norms. Using the tools of modern activism, such as the creation of a political organization running for power, social work branch, religious preaching, schools building, and at some point armed wing to fight when needed, like in Palestine in the 30s and 40s, the Muslim Brotherhood is now criticized for not being strictly Salafis, according to most of the Salafi clerics and scholars, contemporary Salafi scholars. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, used to define his conception as turned towards activism and not theory. He is clearly connected to the legacy of the modernist Salafis who have attempted to offer a renewed comprehension of Islam based on the return to the very first generations of Muslims, outreaching in these ways the teaching of the traditional schools that have been forming Sunnism historically, as well as the use of the reason in the way religious values and norms should be or not understood at their times. However, influenced in this regard by Rashid al-Reda, in addition of people like Jihad-Din Adraoui and Mohamed-Ali Adraoui, who are Salafists in the 19th century, Hassan al-Banna was much radical in his way of understanding and promoting his da'wah, his preaching. Using the triptych Salafiyya, Askariya, Sufiya, Salafism, militarism, Sufism, he is not recognized by the Salafi preachers and clerics close to the legacy of, for example, Abdul Wahab in Saudi Arabia, as an authentic defender of Islam, especially since the Muslim Brothers influenced movements seem to have privileged seizing power and challenging at any price the political insiders within the Islamic world. I mean political leaders such as kings, presidents, military men who have been used to rule the Muslim countries from the independence until the present times. And if Hassan al-Banna, for instance, was extremely aware of the fact that his movement needed to have a clear vision of what the concept of jihad implied, he favored first of all social and political activism, mentioning the necessity to undertake an armed jihad be safe, jihad through the sword, only in case. His famous sentence, usually seen as the core belief and motto of the Muslim Brotherhood, does unquestionably refer to the jihad as possibly an armed action. He used to say, Allah, so God, is our objective. The Prophet is our leader. The Quran is our law. Jihad is our way. Dying in the way of God or Allah is our highest hope. Allahu Akbar. So, God is the greatest. That is why some configurations have been clearly described as legitimate situations for this kind of jihad with the sword. Historically, according to the Muslim Brotherhood, the main and most typical case for jihad with weaponry is Palestine, especially since 1948. However, moving across centuries, the major religious and political milestone towards a certain degree of generalization of jihad that we can see, by the way, at the first milestone towards jihadism, is due to another Muslim brother named this time Sayyid Qutb, another who came after Hassan al-Banna, and who has offered a couple of years after Hassan al-Banna was murdered in 1949 a more revolutionary approach to Islamic militancy or activism, and emerging in the context of a greater pressure against the Muslim brothers from the Egyptian military regime. This man, Sayyid Qutb, undertook an in-depth explanation of the situation of the Muslim people at that time. Why Hassan al-Banna has always tried to answer the question, what went wrong in the history of the Muslim societies, Qutb actually focused on two crucial questions. What went wrong, okay, but also why the Islamist movement had failed. Advocating for an even more radical position, echoing to the need to get rid of any un-Islamic power, legislation, regime that would not strictly obey God. He called it Tawheed al-Hakimiyya, unicity not only in how God would look like, but what God has to do in terms of unicity in the rule, the leadership, the governance. He at least symbolically introduced this way a major turmoil, in Islamic society's contemporary history. Any Muslim or group of Muslims risking to be declared as unbeliever, kafir, on the account of some specific action, discourse, or opinion. We call it takfir or excommunication. Any sin could be considered to have brought back his culprit to the time of Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance. Furthermore, at that time, which means in the 50s and the 60s, some Muslim brothers imprisoned in the military jails have started in the aftermath of Sayyid Qutb's writings to think about the Islamicness of the people starving and torturing them. In this respect, the Muslims who are in the same time wrongdoers, in their views, because they target the true Muslims, the Muslim brothers, the Islamists, that the Muslim brothers are supposed to be, can no longer be considered to be Muslims. At least in the eye of some Muslim brothers who are at that time in jail, in prison. Some of them even refuse to pray with other fellow Muslims who are also in prison with them, and start advocating for a new sort of Islamic credential, which is no longer Muslim in Arabic, but Islamawiyun in Arabic, the Islamists. It's no longer about being a Muslim, it's about being an Islamist. That's what it counts. The one who is aware enough that faith and practice are not enough, and that the true teachings of Islam command that you commit to a political framework, and beyond that, a revolutionary framework. This groundbreaking point, in the history of Islamic representations, due to the confrontation against what start to be seen as impious regimes, like for example, the military regime in Egypt at that time, and Hukm al-Jahili al-Kafir, so impious regime, provides with the broad framework inside which the jihadist thought have been emerging over the last decades. Influencing the first activist, radical and violent groups that started rising in the 70s in Egypt, this legacy has found its most famous achievement in 1981, when the President Sadat passed away as a victim of the Tandim al-Jihad, Organization for the Jihad, led by someone called Islambuli, who declared when he shot President, "I have killed Pharaoh." So comparing Sadat, who was supposedly a Muslim leader, to actually a pre-Islamic ruler, the Pharaoh. In the wake of this Qutbist legacy, such as other people, like for example Abdeslam Farag, authored one of the most well-known jihad books at that time, titled "The Neglected Duty Al-Farida Al-Ghaiba," Neglected Duty, referring to the jihad with weaponry published in the 70s, and thousands of young Egyptians who would embody the first cohort at that time, or from that time onwards, of modern jihadists before their young history, then before their history meets global geopolitics in Afghanistan from the 80s. This pioneering vanguard, Talia in Arabic, would in this way find a field for prospering in Afghanistan since the 80s. During the 80s, another famous jihadist thinker is going to train and educate a generation of fighters, Egyptians, Saudis, Jordanians, and even Europeans. At that time, the Soviet Union, supported by most of the pro-West Arab countries, starting with Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, of course the US, even China, these, what we call at that time, freedom fighters, who received funding, legitimacy, and strategic opportunities for growth under the religious aura of someone called Abdullah Yusuf al-Haddam, the Imam of the Jihad, and his followers used to call him the Imam of the Jihad, finally gave birth to Al-Qaeda in the 80s, which is considered to be the matrix of all jihadist movements nowadays. Hazzam's trademark slogan was Jihad and the rifle alone, no negotiations, no conferences, and no dialogues. In a very famous book, Hazzam, this book titled Join the Caravan, so join the pioneering avant-garde. Hazzam implored Muslims to rally in defense of all Muslim victims of aggression, which is until now the source of jihadi activism and expansion all over the world, as wherever some Muslims are under attack and endangered, in Palestine, in Bosnia, Chechnya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Algeria, in Egypt, and so forth, the political landscape is now and still for numerous years filled by some religious and political players able to mobilize symbolical and material resources in order to turn all kinds of conflicts into sacred struggles for the sake of Islam, God and His Prophet. Abdullah Azzam used to say, I quote, "Those who believe that Islam can flourish and be victorious without jihad, fighting and blood are deluded and have no understanding of the nature of this religion." Al-Qaeda would become, in this period, the organization that would embody this pioneering avant-garde that Qutb and then Addam, advocated for years before. Abdullah Azzam preached that jihad was, first, the transcendent in importance. 1 hour in the path of jihad is worth more than 70 years of praying at home. That's what he used to say. And this jihad has a global significance. If a piece of Muslim land, like the size of a handspan, is infringed upon, then jihad becomes fard al-ayn, a personal obligation, an obligation on every Muslim, male and female, where the child shall march forward without the permission of its parents, and the wife without the permission of the husband. And then, finally, Muslims cannot be defeated by others. We Muslims are not defeated by our enemies, but instead we are defeated by our own selves. This legacy is still even discussed up to now at the heart of the jihadist school, and because it refers to very specific and global religious and political debates in addition to non-religious factors like psychology, like geopolitics and so on, the state of some Muslim societies, I can conclude with some of the key questions that the jihadi thinkers have been asking and that explain a large part of the current history of jihadist international or transnational mobilizations throughout the Islamic world and even beyond. These key questions are still relevant, until now with ISIS. Is violence something legitimate regarding the current situation of the Muslim nowadays? Or should we go for violence? Should we go for political participation? Should we reject any sort of political activism? What should we do? Violence is in this way, in this regard, the favored way. Is violence something normal or an exception towards, what kind of enemies should we use violence? What kind of regimes? Should the non-Muslim regimes, non-Islamic countries, for example, be targeted by us, by the jihadists? What kind of violence? Against whom? Who is the enemy? The fake Muslims, the non-Muslims, Israel, the US, what kind of regime? And is terrorism to that end something legitimate? If we have to do jihad, weaponized jihad, is terrorism a legitimate tool or legitimate way for fighting our enemies? Is, for example, are suicide bombings justified on an Islamic perspective? Are civilians legitimate targets? Yes or no? What is the geographical field for jihad and which strategy to follow? Should we go for a global jihad like Al-Qaeda or a state building or caliphate building strategy with the Islamic State? What comes first, jihad or the caliphate or jihad? So today, should we talk about one form of jihadism or several forms of jihadisms? The mess. So that's going to be the end of my first part, and I'm going to tell you more now just to have, so you can have more contemporary overview, and by focusing on the issue, I'm going to be much quicker here. On the European, configuration. These people, can be seen. Sorry. It's okay? Okay. These people, for example, can be seen as European fighters, jihadist fighters today who are involved in the Syrian conflicts. This presentation has been, I already did it, but I want you to have a look at the faces, the many faces of contemporary Salafism and jihadism. So, no, it's not what I'm going to. No, this is what I want to show you. Today, for example, as far as we assume that Syria is one of the main theaters for contemporary jihad, this is how basically the jihad in Syria has been working over the last several years. So today we estimate that we have 30, 40, 50,000 fighters today, jihadi fighters, operating in Syria, and you can see how many people, come from Europe and, for example, from Belgium. Here, for example, you can see that this idea of a transnational insurrection or revolutionary struggle for Islam has become very transnational. Probably today, jihad, or this version of jihad or jihadism, has never been more global than today. You can see that the country on the top, can you read? Among European countries. So you have the golden medal here in Belgium. So you have 40 jihadi, Belgian jihadists actually for 1 million people. Sorry, I'm a bit I'm old. In terms of proportion, Belgian jihadists are probably today the most numerous, or more than probably, they are the most numerous actually. And according to experts and scholars, we know that the 3 main countries sending fighters to Syria today, not in terms of numbers, in terms of proportions, are Belgium, Kosovo, and Tunisia. So you have 2 European countries when it comes to the people who are today, the jihadist fighters who are today in Syria. I want you to have a look at this when I talk about Salafism and jihadism. So I was mentioning it before, when I ended my first part, this difference today that we can observe among jihadists between the 2 strategies. Should we go for a global jihad, like from one country to another, from Syria to Iraq, from Iraq to Libya, from Libya to Yemen, from Yemen to another country, or should we focus on a more caliphate building strategy oriented strategy? So for example, some scholars explain that one of the reasons why we have so many people today involved in the jihadist struggle in Syria, it's because we have a turmoil in the agenda, the jihadist global agenda. Today the jihadists they have a state, or a so-called state, the Khilafah, on the left here, which is the Arabic name for caliphate, as you may know. And it's not only about having this strategy or promoting this strategy, it's about promoting a new, you have, let's say, 2 pillars. First of all, a very, let's say, state-oriented or caliphate-oriented strategy, as you can see on the left, but also on the right, the flood, which refers to a kind of utopian and eschatological perspective, which means that the end of times are coming. The Syrian jihad, it's not like in Afghanistan in the 80s. It's not only one jihad among many others. That may be the ultimate jihad. That may be, the last jihad or the final one. And after that, we may have the end of time and the return of some of the angels, of some prophets, to declare that the world is over, the world history, mankind is over, and now, we are going to go for a judgment day. So according to some experts, actually, to some scholars, these 2 dimensions, these 2 are extremely important to understand why the jihadist ISIS appeal, the ISIS jihad appeal, is so important today. And you can see on the top of the picture, Dabiq, Dabiq, which is the ISIS or ISIL review's name. Dabiq refers to a city in the northern part of Syria, from which actually the end of times are supposed, to emerge and to come up. Dabiq actually, according to some people in the Jihad Islamic debates, is the city, the place where the Antichrist. There is no Antichrist in Islam because there is no Christ actually. But let's call it the Antichrist actually. He's supposed to come from Dabiq. So the ultimate challenge, the ultimate battle for God is supposed to start in this place. That's why they have called, their journal Dabiq, which is the city, the name of the city, in the northern part of Syria, from which, the end of time are supposed to come up. On a more sociological, perspective, how can we explain, this jihadist engagement or this jihadist, commitment? We tend to believe, as scholars actually, that we have a generational effect. Because people who go there, of course they are Muslims, and many of them are actually converts. But in the same time, most of them belong to a very specific generation. It's very, very, let's say, rare to see people who are 60 or 70 years old committing themselves to the jihadist struggle. So, this idea that it's first of all a struggle for the young or some of the young Islamic generation is extremely important. We have a second element, which is what some people call the deculturations. The idea that what they are interested in is not a traditional Islam. Many of them are children of migrants, they have some immigrant background, but also there is a rupture with their parents' and grandparents' legacy. They are not interested in, let's say, the so-called Islamic principles, traditional principles. We have a very famous, we have very famous cases of people, maybe you know what I'm referring to, who actually have turned into jihadist or jihadist profiles actually in a very short period of time. So, of course, you do not become a radical in only 2 weeks, but the idea, of joining a jihadist movement, in a very short period of time, is something that we can easily observe on when we study, the contemporary waves of contemporary jihadist profiles. We also have a high proportion of converts. So there is this idea to some people, maybe you heard of the scholar Olivier Roy, the French expert on jihadism. To him, it's not necessarily a kind of radicalization of Islam, but an Islamization of radicalism, or an Islamization of the imagination, of the subjectivity, because of the desecularization and re-enchantment, of the word. And then, third point, the appeal to violence and what we can call a religious great design. Many of them are, first of all, interested and even fascinated by violence. So, for example, if you want to talk about the French jihadist or the Belgian jihadist, around half of them actually have a criminal background. 40%, 45%, it depends, but let's say almost 1 out of 2. And there is a clear, small part of religiously motivated behaviors. We have this very famous sentence from a French jihadist saying, "I don't care about Islam, what I want is jihad." And then, last but not least, jihadism is not only about violence. Should we look at jihadism today as a counterculture, with pictures, with videos, with movies, with narratives, with slogans, with stories, and so on and so on? Well, thank you very much. I'm going to end up here, and I hope it was clear enough. Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation.